A man and an ink-black German shepherd walk through a frozen town where every window is a judging eye. Silas Vance is an elite SEAL, but his dog Aries is the one who senses the ghosts. Why would a war-hardened dog whine at a sheriff's shadow and dig up a compass belonging to a dead man? Aries isn't just tracking a scent. He's hunting a truth that was buried under years of ice. From a terrifying encounter in a general store to a gunshot that changes everything, the intuition of a dog is about to rewrite the history of North Creek. Some secrets are meant to stay frozen, but Aries is about to melt them all. This is a story of a bond that defies death itself. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below, and please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of hope and healing. The wind over the boundary waters of Minnesota did not just blow. It screamed, a relentless, jagged blade of ice that carved through the ancient pine forests and turned the world into a monochromatic landscape of blinding white and charcoal shadows. Silas Ghost Vance moved through the sleet with the heavy, rhythmic gait of a man who had walked through hell and found the temperature to his liking. At 38, Silas carried the geometry of a warrior, shoulders broad as an oak beam, a jawline carved from granite, and eyes the color of a frozen lake, pale and depthless. His face was a map of forgotten skirmishes, marked by a thin scar that bifurcated his left eyebrow and a permanent shadow of stubble that hid the tension in his lips. He wore a faded, oil-stained Carhartt jacket that smelled of wood smoke and old gunpowder, his hands shoved deep into pockets to hide the slight, involuntary tremor that only came when the silence got too loud. He was a ghost in his own hometown, a pariah branded by the scarlet letter of a failed mission that had claimed the life of Liam Miller, the town's golden boy. The locals saw Silas as the coward who came home while their hero stayed behind in a flag-draped coffin, and that collective hatred had turned the air of North Creek into something thick and suffocating. Beside him, blending into the swirling snow like a fragment of the night itself, was Aries. The German shepherd was a massive creature, 90 pounds of coiled muscle and ink-black fur that seemed to absorb the dim winter light. At 8 years old, Aries was a retired veteran of the same elite SEAL team Silas had served in, his body bearing the same jagged history, a missing notch from his left ear and a slight stiffness in his rear hip from a shrapnel wound in Jailbad. Aries didn't just walk. He patrolled, his amber eyes scanning the tree line with a terrifying, calculated intelligence. He was a soul reader, a dog that looked not at a person's face, but at the vibration of their heart. Between Silas and Aries, there was no need for a leash. They were tethered by a psychic cord forged in the dust of war. Aries knew when Silas's lungs were constricting from a PTSD flashback before Silas even felt the first pinch of anxiety. He was the only thing keeping the man from slipping entirely into the abyss. As they pushed through the heavy oak doors of the town's general store, the bell chimed with a lonely, tinny sound that died instantly. The warmth inside was oppressive, smelling of floor wax, stale coffee, and the unspoken judgment of the 4 men huddled near the wood stove. The store owner, a spindly man named Hank, with skin like crumpled parchment and eyes that refused to meet Silas's, stopped mid-sentence. The silence was tactical, the kind Silas used to encounter in enemy territory. He walked toward the back aisle, his boots thudding softly on the hardwood, looking for the high-grade joint supplements Aries needed to survive the brutal winter. He could feel their stairs needles of resentment pressing into his back. To them, Silas was a thief who had stolen the life of a better man and returned with nothing but a black dog and a haunted stare. Suddenly, the heavy atmosphere shifted. Aries, who usually moved with a silent, stoic grace, came to a dead halt in the center of the store. He didn't growl. He didn't bark. Instead, he stood perfectly rigid, his hackles rising in a slow, deliberate wave from his neck to his tail. His head tilted at an impossible angle, his amber eyes locked onto the floorboards beneath the heavy desk of Sheriff Miller, who had just stepped out from the back office. The sheriff was a mountain of a man in his late 50s, his belly straining against a tan uniform shirt that bore more medals than his service record actually justified. His face was flushed a deep, unhealthy red, and his eyes were small and predatory. As the sheriff approached, Aries did something that made the hair on the back of Silas's neck stand up. The dog let out a low, mournful whine, a sound he had only ever made over the bodies of fallen brothers in the field. Aries then sat down, stared directly into Miller's shadow, and began to shiver, not from cold, but from an overwhelming primal revulsion. It was a spiritual alarm, a signal that something foul, something that didn't belong in the light, was standing right in front of them. The sheriff froze, his hand instinctively hovering near his holster, his face twisting into a mask of disgusted fear. "Control your beast, Vance," Miller spat, his voice a gravelly rasp that shook with a tremor he couldn't quite hide. Silas didn't move. He watched Aries, then looked at the sheriff, realizing that the dog wasn't reacting to the man's authority, but to a scent, the faint, metallic tang of old blood, and the ozone of a secret kept too long. The tension in the room snapped like a frozen branch. Silas stepped forward, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "He isn't a beast, Sheriff. He's a mirror. If you don't like what you see, maybe you should stop looking." The other men shifted uncomfortably, the air suddenly too thin for them to breathe. Silas reached down and placed a hand on Aries' head. The dog's shivering stopped instantly, replaced by a cold, predatory focus. Silas grabbed the supplements and tossed a crumpled $20 bill onto the counter without waiting for change. He didn't look back at the sheriff, whose hand was still trembling near his hip, or at the townspeople who watched them like they were omens of a coming plague. He walked out into the biting wind, the cold feeling like a homecoming after the suffocating heat of the store. As they reached the edge of the woods, Aries stopped one last time, looking back at the glowing windows of the town with a deep, guttural huff of breath. Silas looked down at his shadow, his only friend, and felt the weight of the dog's intuition settling in his chest. Aries wasn't just sensing a grudge. He was sensing a debt that was about to be collected. The storm was no longer just outside. It was beginning to stir within the very foundation of North Creek, and Silas knew, with the certainty of a man who had seen death's face, that Aries would be the one to lead him through the coming fire. They disappeared into the white veil of the forest, two ghosts reclaimed by the wilderness, leaving behind a town that had forgotten that the truth, much like a winter wolf, always finds its way home. The blue hour had descended upon North Creek, a deceptive, ghostly twilight that turned the snow-clogged pines into jagged silhouettes against a bruised sky. Silas Vance trudged along the shoulder of the winding forest road, the rhythmic crunch of his boots the only sound in the suffocating stillness. The encounter at the general store remained a bitter coal in his chest, radiating a heat that made his breath come in shallow, ragged bursts. Beside him, Aries moved like a dark tide, his massive head occasionally brushing against Silas's thigh. Grounding touch meant to pull his master back from the precipice of a panic attack. Silas struggled to reconcile the dog's reaction to Sheriff Miller. Aries was trained to detect explosives and hidden enemies, but in the general store, he had reacted as if the sheriff were a walking carcass, a vessel of something. So spiritually decayed, it had triggered a primal, mournful whine. Silas felt the phantom weight of Liam's death pressing down on his shoulders again, the town's collective accusation echoing in the whistling wind, until he reached a small, weathered building on the outskirts of town, North Creek Veterinary and Wellness. It was the only sanctuary left where Silas's money was accepted without a side of venom, largely because of the woman who ran it. Iris Thorne was a force of nature who seemed to have been forged in the same fire as the veteran she treated. At 42, she was a woman of Anishinaabe heritage, with skin the color of polished cedar and eyes so dark they looked like obsidian, sharp enough to cut through any lie Silas tried to tell. She stood, about 5'8", her athletic frame draped in charcoal scrubs and a heavy salt and pepper wool cardigan. Her hair, as black as a raven's wing, was pulled back into a severe practical braid that reached the small of her back. Aris was a former Army combat medic who had spent 3 tours patching together soldiers in the dust of the Middle East, a history written in the steady, unflinching way. She moved her hands. She didn't offer Silas the empty, hollow smiles of the townspeople. She offered him the silence of a fellow survivor. As Silas entered the warm, sage-scented clinic, Aris looked up from a microscope, her face a mask of weary competence. "You look like you've been chewing on glass, Silas," she said, her voice a rich contralto that carried the authority of an officer. And, Aries smells like he's been standing in a room full of ghosts. Silas didn't answer immediately, instead watching as Aries walked straight to the corner of Aris's office and sat down. He didn't go to the water bowl or the treats she kept for him. Instead, the dog stared intensely at a small wooden shelf where Aris kept a framed, faded photograph of a group of soldiers in desert tan uniforms. Suddenly, the air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Aries began to let out a rhythmic, soft huff of breath, his tail thumping once, twice against the floorboards, as if acknowledging someone standing in the empty space between the desk and the door. Silas froze, his hand tightening on the strap of his bag. Aries only did that for 3 people: Silas, himself, and Liam Miller. For a heartbeat that stretched into an eternity, the dog's ears perked up and his eyes tracked the movement across the room that neither human could see. Aries' gaze finally settled on Silas, and the dog let out a sharp, command-like bark, the same one he used to give when a teammate was drifting off course in the field. It was a jolt of pure electric intuition that bypassed Silas's logic. Aries wasn't just sensing the past, he was reacting to a presence that felt as real as the cold outside. Aris watched the dog, her dark eyes narrowing with a look of profound, clinical curiosity and something that bordered on spiritual recognition. "He's seeing the vibration, Silas," she whispered, her hands remaining perfectly still on the counter. "My people believe dogs are the bridge. They don't see the body. They see the intent of the spirit. If Aries is restless, it's because the truth about Liam isn't as buried as the sheriff wants it to be." She stepped around the counter, her movements fluid and cat-like, and handed Silas a fresh bottle of painkillers, not for the dog, but for the man. "Take Aries up to the ridge tonight, Silas. Don't go back to that cabin yet. He's pulling you somewhere for a reason, and if you ignore him, you're ignoring the only compass you have left." Silas took the bottle, his fingers brushing her calloused hand, and for a moment, the shared weight of their trauma felt lighter. He didn't know how Aris knew about the pull he felt toward the northern hills, but he had learned long ago that combat medics had a sixth sense for the dying, even when the death was of the soul. Of the soul. Leaving the clinic, Silas felt the magnetic pull of the mountain, a silent command vibrating through Aris's leashless presence. They veered off the main road, cutting through a thicket of white birch that led toward the high ridge, where Alara Vance lived in her isolated, light-filled sanctuary. Aries was no longer walking. He was leading, his body low to the ground, his nose working the frozen air with a desperate, frantic energy. The animal intuition Silas had trusted with his life in 100 war zones, was screaming at him now. As they crested the hill, the wind died down just enough for Silas to hear a faint, rhythmic scratching sound coming from the darkness near the edge of Alara's porch. Ares lunged forward, not with aggression, but with the focused urgency of a rescue dog. Silas broke into a run, his boots slipping on the black ice, until he saw the silhouette of the elderly woman sprawled on the frozen earth, her silver hair fanned out like a halo against the snow. Ares was already there, his massive body pressed against her side to provide heat, his head resting gently on her chest to monitor her shallow, fluttering heartbeat. Silas realized then that Ares hadn't led him here to save Alara from a simple fall. He had led him here to bridge the gap between two broken legacies. In the pale moonlight, as Silas knelt to lift the fragile woman, he looked into Ares's amber eyes and saw not a dog, but a guardian who had finally found the mission that would either break them or set them free. The interior of Alara Vance's home was a sanctuary of amber light and the scent of linseed oil, a stark contrast to the predatory cold howling just beyond the cedar walls. Silas carried the elderly woman toward the heavy velvet sofa, his muscles burning with a familiar tactical fatigue as he moved her with the practiced gentleness of a man who had lifted fallen brothers from red-stained sands. Alara Vance, at 72, was a delicate porcelain figure whose elegance had not yet been fully eroded by age. Her skin was the color of aged parchment, crisscrossed with fine lines that spoke of a lifetime of laughter and long-forgotten sorrows. Her hair, a shimmering halo of unspun silk, was disheveled from the fall, and her eyes, a startling, translucent violet, were clouded with the milky film of advancing cataracts. As Silas laid her down and wrapped her in a heavy wool throw, he could feel the cold radiating from her fragile bones. Ares immediately took his position on the rug beside her, his massive black body acting as a living furnace, his ears flicking toward the kitchen as he monitored the house for intruders or shadows. Alara blinked, her gaze wandering toward the ceiling as if she were trying to locate her position on a map she no longer recognized. "The light is fading, Michael," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle of autumn leaves, mistaking Silas for the sun, who had never returned. Silas felt a sharp, jagged ache in his ribs, the kind that no military-grade painkiller could numb, but he simply knelt beside her, rubbing her cold hands while Ares let out a soft, rhythmic huff of breath meant to calm her fluttering heart. Silas moved through the kitchen to brew a pot of herbal tea, his eyes scanning the walls covered in Alara's artwork, vivid, haunting landscapes of the boundary waters that seemed to glow from within. Suddenly, the domestic silence was pierced by a strange, sharp scrape of claws on wood. Silas turned to see Ares, standing in the center of Alara's studio, his hackles perfectly flat, but his body vibrating with a concentrated intensity. The dog wasn't looking at Silas. He was staring at a half-finished portrait of a young man in a dress. Uniform Liam Miller. Ares walked to the base of the easel and did something that made Silas's blood turn to slush. The dog let out a sharp, joyful yip, the specific greeting he had used only for Liam when they returned from long patrols. Ares then nudged a heavy, hand-carved wooden chest tucked beneath the easel, his nose pressing into a hidden seam in the oak. He looked back at Silas, with a gaze so lucid and pleading it felt like a physical command. The dog began to tap the chest with his paw, 3 short beats, a pause, then one, a Morse code signal for safe that Silas and Liam had used during night operations. It was an impossible coincidence, a gesture that defied the boundaries of animal intelligence and ventured into the realm of a lingering, desperate spirit trying to communicate through the only vessel left that could see him. The heavy thud of a vehicle door echoed from the driveway, followed by the aggressive crunch of boots on the porch. The door burst open, admitting a blast of frigid air and the towering skeletal figure of Sarah Miller. At 55, Sarah was the physical manifestation of a grief that had fermented into a poison. She was tall and painfully thin, her features sharpened into a mask of perpetual bitterness. Her hair was an ash-gray bird's nest pulled into a tight, punishing bun, and her skin was translucent, revealing the blue veins pulsing in her temples. She wore a high-collared black coat that made her look like a Victorian mourner who had lost her way in time. Sarah's eyes, a flinty, washed-out blue, landed on Silas with a hatred so visceral it felt like a physical blow. "Get away from her, you parasite," she spat, her voice a jagged RSP that cracked the fragile peace of the room. She didn't look at Alara with concern. She looked at Silas as if he were the shadow that had personally extinguished her son's life. Sarah was a woman who had once been the heart of the town's social circle, but Liam's death had turned her into a recluse who fed only on her own resentment. She moved toward Alara with a jerky, possessive motion, pushing Silas aside as if he were nothing more than a stain on the floorboards. Aries didn't growl, but he stood his ground between Sarah and the sofa, his amber eyes narrowing into a cold, predatory focus that warned her he was not a pet, but a guardian. Sarah flinched, the sheer presence of the black shepherd making her realize that the power in the room had shifted. Silas stood up slowly, his broad frame casting a long, intimidating shadow over the grieving woman. She fell in the snow, Sarah. She would have frozen if Ares hadn't found her. Silas sighed, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. Sarah's lip curled in a sneer as she looked at the dog, then at the wooden chest Ares had just been nudging. A flicker of something that looked remarkably like fear crossed her face for a fleeting second before she masked it with renewed fury. "You have no right to be here, Silas Vance. You lived, and my boy didn't. That's the only truth that matters in this town," she hissed, her fingers clenching into claws. Alara stirred on the sofa, her violet eyes clearing for a brief, lucid moment as she looked at Silas, then at Ares, and finally at the chest. "The boy didn't die, Sarah," Alara whispered, her voice suddenly strong and certain. "The dog knows. He's been waiting for him to come home." The silence that followed was heavy with a secret that seemed to vibrate in the very air, leaving Silas standing in the center of a storm that was no longer about the cold, but about the ghost that Ares had finally begun to hunt. The brutal truce inside Alara's home shattered not with a word, but with the frantic arrival of Marcus Reed, a local trapper whose face was a roadmap of broken capillaries and weathered leather. He burst through the cedar door, bringing a swirl of predatory frost that made the candles flicker and die. Marcus was a squat man in his late 50s, built like a fire hydrant with a salt and pepper beard matted with ice crystals. His eyes, usually clouded by the haze of cheap whiskey, now wide with a raw, sobering terror. "The girl," Marcus wheezed, his voice a jagged rasp against the sudden silence. "Maya, she's gone." Her mother found the back door swinging in the wind 3 hours ago. The sheriff's deputies say the drifts are too high for the vehicles, and they're calling it a runaway case, Silas. They aren't coming. Maya was a 10-year-old, ember of warmth in North Creek's cold heart, a girl with skin like dark cocoa, and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes in a hurricane. She was the only person in town who didn't look at Silas's scars, She only looked at Ares' ears, often sneaking him bits of dried jerky when her mother wasn't looking. Silas felt a cold, familiar iron settle in his gut, the tactical focus of a SEAL Team 6 operator overriding the exhaustion of his soul. He didn't look at Sarah Miller's sneer or Alara's confused violet eyes. He simply reached for his tactical belt. "Ares, track," Silas commanded, his voice a low, lethal vibration. The black shepherd didn't hesitate. He lunged toward the open door, his massive paws churning the fresh powder into a white wake as they vanished into the throat of the blizzard. The forest was a wall of screaming static, the wind whipping through the pines, until they sounded like the rotors of a downed Blackhawk. Silas pushed through the hip-deep snow, his lungs burning as the shrapnel in his chest protested the sub-zero air, but his eyes never left the rhythmic bob of Ares' dark tail ahead of him. The dog was a phantom, a creature of shadow and instinct, weaving through the white veil with a desperate, frantic energy that went beyond simple scent tracking. Every few hundred yards, Ares would pause, his nose held high to catch a microscopic fragment of Maya's scent amidst the ozone and pine. Suddenly, deep within the obsidian heart of the Blackwood Preserve, Ares stopped. Dead. He didn't bark for a trail. Instead, he began to dig furiously into a snowbank beside a frozen creek bed, his muffled growl sounding like grinding stones. Silas moved toward him, expecting to find a piece of a child's coat or a discarded mitten. Instead, Ares clamped his teeth onto something metallic and pulled it free, dropping it at Silas's feet. Silas knelt, clearing the frost away with a trembling hand, and felt a jolt of ice water in his veins that had nothing to do with the Minnesota winter. In his palm lay a specialized high-altitude SEAL navigation compass, the brass casing engraved with the initials LMUM. This was Liam Miller's compass, an item that was supposed to have been incinerated in the helicopter crash 3 years ago. As Silas stared at the compass, the needle didn't point north. It spun wildly, erratically, as if the very laws of physics were being distorted by a presence nearby. Ares let out a low, mournful howl that vibrated in Silas's very marrow, his amber eyes locked onto a nearby ridge where a silhouette moved, a figure too tall to be a child, draped in a tattered military parka, disappearing into the white haze like a ghost returning to its grave. The revelation hit Silas like a physical blow, but the urgent, distant cry of a child snapped him back to the mission. Ares lunged toward the sound, leading Silas toward the jagged mouth of the old widow mine, a collapsed labyrinth of shafts that had been deemed a death trap decades ago. The scent of Maya was thick here, but so was the musk of something else. Wolves, a pack of the gray shadows, had cornered the girl near a precarious ledge of black ice. Maya was huddled in a crevice, her small body shivering violently, her eyes wide with a terror that no 10-year-old should ever know. As the lead wolf, a massive, scarred alpha with eyes like rotting yellow fruit, prepared to spring, Ares became a blur of ink-black fury. He didn't wait for a command. He launched himself across the gap, his 90 pounds of muscle colliding with the alpha in midair. The sound of the struggle was primal, a cacophony of snarls, snapping, bone, and a wet tear of fur. Silas drew his combat knife, his boots slipping on the frozen scree as he joined the fray, his SEAL training turning his movements into a lethal dance of steel and precision. He drove the blade into the flank of a second wolf, his blood roaring with a protective rage he hadn't felt since the day he lost his team. Ares took a deep bite to his shoulder, but he refused to give ground, his body a living shield between the predators and the girl. When the pack finally broke, and fled into the darkness, the silence. That followed was heavy with the smell of copper and salt. Silas collapsed beside Maya, pulling her into the warmth of his heavy jacket, while Aries stood over them, his black fur stained crimson, his chest heaving as he stared back into the dark mine shaft. Maya reached out a trembling, frostbitten hand and touched Aries' notched ear. "The man in the green coat," she whispered her, voice barely audible over the wind. "He told me you were coming, Silas," he said. "The dog would find me because the dog still knows the way home." Silas looked at Liam's compass in his pocket, then at the blood on Aries' coat, realizing that the rescue of Maya was only the beginning of a reckoning that would rip North Creek apart. He hoisted the girl onto his back, his jaw set in a hard, grim line, and began the agonizing trek back toward the light, with Aries limping faithfully at his side, a silent guardian of secrets that refused to stay buried. The world was a blurring kaleidoscope of freezing wind and the rhythmic, heavy thud of Silas's heart as he broke through the tree line, his body a trembling engine of pure willpower. Maya was a feather-light weight on his back, her small arms locked around his neck in a desperate, frozen grip, while Aries moved at his flank like a dying star, dimming but refusing to go out. The black shepherd's gait was a harrowing, uneven limp. The wolf's bite had torn deep into his muscular shoulder, and crimson droplets now decorated the pristine snow like scattered rubies. Silas could see the flickering orange strobe of emergency lights through the white veil, a cluster of vehicles blocking the forest access road. Standing at the center of the perimeter was Sheriff Miller, his massive frame silhouetted against the glare, looking less like a lawman and more like a gargoyle carved from ice. Beside him stood Jace Rollins, a junior deputy barely 24, with a lanky, nervous build and a face still soft with youth, though his eyes were wide and twitching with an anxiety that didn't match the cold. Jace was the kind of boy who had joined the force for the pride of the badge, but now looked like a bird trapped in a predatory cage, his gloved hands fumbling with a heavy flashlight as he watched Silas emerge from the darkness, like a vengeful revenant. As Silas stepped into the wash of the headlights, the air turned electric with a tension that felt more dangerous than the wolves. "I found her," Silas rasped, his voice a jagged shard of glass, but he didn't stop moving toward the heated cabin of the nearest SUV. The sheriff didn't move to help. He stood rooted, his jaw set in a hard, white line as his eyes landed on the blood-stained black dog, and then shifted to the specialized brass compass dangling from Silas's tactical vest. Rollins stepped forward, his breath hitching. "God, Silas, you actually did it. You brought her back." But the sheriff's hand slammed against the boy's chest, shoving him back with a silent, bruising force. "Stay back, Jace," Miller growled, his voice a low, vibrating warning. Miller stepped into Silas's path, his small eyes fixed on Liam's compass with a look of raw, naked panic that he tried to mask as authority. "Hand her over, Vance. You're under arrest for the abduction of a minor and interfering with a federal investigation." Rollins cuff the dog. Silas came to a dead halt, the absurdity of the accusation slamming into him with the force of a physical blow. He looked at the sheriff, then down at Aries, who had suddenly stopped panting. The dog stood perfectly still, his amber eyes fixed not on the sheriff, but on the empty, swirling snow just to the left of the man's shoulder. It was then that the rehook of pure, chilling intuition struck Silas. He saw a man's handprint and fresh, vibrant blood on Aris's black harness. A handprint far too large to be Maya's and positioned where only a man standing at Silas's height could have placed it. Aries tilted his head, his ears perking up as if listening to a whisper in the wind and a faint, metallic scent of military-grade gun oil, the kind Liam always used, wafted over them despite the blizzard. For a heartbeat, Silas didn't see the sheriff. He saw the reflection of a much larger conspiracy in the man's terrified gaze, a realization that Liam hadn't died in that crash, but had been hidden away by the very man meant to uphold the law, and Maya had accidentally stumbled upon the grave that wasn't a grave. The sheriff saw the realization dawn on Silas's face, and the panic finally snapped his restraint. He didn't see a hero. He saw the man who was about to dismantle his life's carefully constructed lie. "I said, get away from the girl!" Miller screamed, his hand flying to his holster. It was a chaotic, fractured second. Rollins cried out in protest. Maya shrieked in terror, and Silas moved to shield the child with his own body. But Ayres was faster. Despite the torn muscle and the bone-deep fatigue, the shepherd launched himself forward, a blur of ink-black fur and protective fury. He wasn't attacking. He was becoming a barricade. A sharp, deafening crack echoed through the valley. The sound of a service pistol discharging with a flash of orange fire. The bullet didn't hit Silas. It slammed into Ayres's flank, the force of the impact spinning the dog around in midair. Ayres hit the snow with a dull, sickening thud, a low, guttural whimper escaping his throat that tore through Silas's soul more violently than any shrapnel ever had. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the hysterical sobbing of Maya and the sound of Silas's breath turning into a predatory growl. Miller stood with his weapon raised, his face pale as ash, realized too late that he had shot a war hero in front of a witness who didn't fear him. Rollins stood frozen, his flashlight dropping to the snow, the beam illuminating the spreading pool of dark blood beneath the dog. Silas didn't draw his knife. He didn't attack. He lowered Maya gently to the ground and knelt beside Ayres, his large, scarred hands pressing into the dog's fur to staunch the flow. He looked up at the sheriff with eyes that were no longer human, but the cold, calculating eyes of a ghost who had just found a reason to return from the dead. "You should have killed me, Miller," Silas whispered, a promise that made the sheriff's gun hand shake uncontrollably. "Because now, the dog isn't the only one hunting you." The chapter closed on a haunting image of Silas cradling his dying friend in the red-stained snow, while the spirit of the forest watched from the shadows, waiting for the blood to call home the truth. The silence following the gunshot was a physical weight, heavier than the freezing Minnesota air. Silas Vance knelt in the snow, his large, scarred hands pressing against Ayres's side where the dark fur was rapidly turning into a warm, sticky sponge. He didn't look at Sheriff Miller, who stood trembling with his service weapon still raised, nor did he look at the sobbing Maya. His entire world had narrowed down to the fading amber light in Ayres's eyes and the rhythmic, weakening pulse beneath his palms. "You chose the wrong side of history, Miller," Silas said, his voice a low, vibrating growl that made Deputy Rollins take a step back. Suddenly, the headlights of a rusted F-150 cut through the white veil, and a man named Eli Bear Thompson climbed out, his presence commanding enough to halt the sheriff's panic. Eli was 60 years old and looked as though he had been carved out of a cedar stump. He was a mountain of a man with shoulders that stretched his grease-stained flannel shirt to its limits. His face was a landscape of deep-set wrinkles and a massive silver and charcoal beard that hung to his chest, hiding a mouth that rarely smiled but often spoke the truth. Bear had been the town's primary mechanic for 40 years, a man who fixed the engines of everyone in North Creek and knew exactly whose soul was leaking oil. He walked straight toward Silas, ignoring. The sheriff shouted orders to stand down, his eyes as dark and steady as well water fixed on the bleeding dog. "Load him in, Vance," Bear commanded, his voice a deep, gravelly bass that brooked no argument. "The sheriff can shoot me, too, if he wants, but this dog has earned his breath." Silas hoisted Ariz's 90-pound frame into the back of Bear's truck, his own Carhartt jacket soaked through with the blood of his brother. As Bear slammed the truck into gear and roared away toward a Reese-Thorne's clinic, Silas sat in the bed of the truck, shielding Ariz from the wind with his own body. About halfway through the harrowing journey, Ariz's breathing slowed to a terrifying rattle. Silas leaned down, his forehead pressing against the dog's wet nose, whispering prayers he hadn't used since the mountains of Tora Bora. Suddenly, Ariz's body jerked with a sharp, electric intensity. The dog's eyes flickered open, but they were no longer clouded by pain. They were startlingly clear, reflecting a light that shouldn't have been there in the pitch-black truck bed. Ariz didn't look at Silas. Instead, he stared intensely at the empty air. Directly behind Silas's shoulder, his tail giving 3 distinct, joyful thumps, the specific Liam greeting. Silas felt a sudden, inexplicable surge of warmth bloom in his chest, a phantom hand resting on his shoulder that smelled faintly of gun oil and the peppermint gum Liam always chewed. Ariz let out a soft, melodic yip, a sound of pure recognition that made the hair on Silas's arms stand up. In that moment, Silas didn't just feel Liam's presence. He heard a whisper in his mind, as clear as a radio transmission. "Keep him going, Ghost. We're not finished yet." The brass compass in Silas's pocket grew searingly hot against his thigh, and the erratic spinning of the needle suddenly stopped, pointing fixedly not toward the north, but back toward the ridge where Alara Vance lived. The arrival at Reese-Thorne's clinic was a blur of violence and precision. Ariz was waiting on the porch, her face a mask of combat-ready stoicism as she and Silas rushed Ariz onto the operating table. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and the iron tang of blood as Ariz began to cut through the ink-black fur. Silas stood as her shadow, his hands clamped on Ariz's paws to keep the dog still, while she worked without anesthesia. The bullet moved Silas. "It's sitting near the spine," Ariz muttered, her forehead beaded with sweat as she worked under the harsh fluorescent lights. Outside, the town of North Creek was waking up to a different kind of storm. Word had traveled through the grapevine Bear had seen to that people began to gather in the snow outside the clinic, the grocery clerk, the trapper Marcus Reed, and even families who had spent years spitting at Silas's feet. They stood in a silent, growing vigil, watching the windows, where the silhouette of a man and a dog fought for survival. Maya stood at the front of the crowd, held tightly by her mother, her small hand clutching a toy shepherd she had found in Bear's truck. The phalanx of hatred that had defined Silas's life in North Creek was finally beginning to crack, replaced by a haunting collective guilt. Silas watched Ariz pull the lead fragment from Ariz's body with a sharp clink into a metal tray, his eyes never leaving the dog's face. Ariz let out a long, trembling breath and finally slipped into a deep, natural sleep. Silas looked out the window at the flickering candles the townspeople had begun to light in the snow, realizing that the blood on the operating table wasn't just a mark of tragedy, but the ink with which the true history of North Creek was finally being rewritten. He looked at the compass one last time, knowing that as soon as Ariz could walk, they would be heading back into the White Veil to find the man who was no longer a ghost, but a living debt that Sheriff Miller would finally have to pay. The fluorescent hum of Aris Thorne's clinic was finally silenced by the first gray light of a Minnesota dawn, a pale, anemic glow that seeped through the frost-patterned windows to illuminate the wreckage of a long, bloody night. Ares lay on the stainless steel table, his ink-black chest rising and falling in a shallow but steady rhythm, the thick bandages around his flank a stark white against his midnight fur. Silas sat on a low stool, his broad shoulders hunched, his hands still stained with the copper residue of his friend's life clutched around Liam's brass compass. The town vigil outside had grown into a silent phalanx of flickering candles, a sea of orange sparks against the blue snow that signaled a collective awakening. Suddenly, the clinic door opened, admitting a gust of crystalline air and a man who looked like he had been carved from the same granite as Silas. Colonel Thomas Sterling, 55, carried the unmistakable iron-straight spine of a career officer, his silver hair cut to a precise quarter-inch, and eyes like cold flint that had seen the rise and fall of empires. He wore a formal black overcoat over a tailored suit, a man of quiet, devastating authority who had served as the commanding officer for both Silas and Liam. Sterling had arrived not as a conqueror, but as a witness, his presence in North Creek, the result of a silent, years-long investigation into the anomalies of the crash that had supposedly killed Liam Miller. He looked at Silas, then at the wounded dog, and gave a single somber nod that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken apologies. The military doesn't forget its own, Silas, Sterling said, his voice a polished low timberbird rasp. But sometimes, the truth is held hostage by those we trust to guard the home front. Silas felt the tectonic plates of his reality shift as Ares's amber eyes snapped open, not with the fog of sedation, but with a terrifying, lucid focus. Despite the bone-deep agony and the fresh stitches, the German shepherd forced himself upright, his 3 good legs trembling as he pushed his weight against Silas's chest. The dog ignored the colonel and the medical equipment. Instead, he stared intently at the back door of the clinic, his notched ears swiveling toward the frozen hills. Ares let out a soft rhythmic huff, and then, with a strength that defied biological limits, he limped to the door and scratched 3 distinct times Liam's old open-up signal from the field. It was the rehook Silas needed, a jolt of pure electric faith that bypassed his trauma. The brass compass in his hand suddenly snapped its needle into a static, vibrating line, pointing with violent certainty toward the high Vachka cliff overlooking the boundary waters. Ares looked back at Silas, his gaze no longer that of a pet, but of a soulmate signaling the final patrol. In that moment, Silas realized that Liam Miller wasn't a ghost haunting the woods. He was a man trapped in the shadows of his own father's shame, waiting for the only 2 beings who could still recognize his heartbeat through the white veil. The final confrontation at the cliff was a tableau of fractured legacies and rising sun. Sheriff Miller stood at the precipice, his service weapon drawn but shaking, the light of dawn revealing the hollow ruined shell of a man who had traded his son's freedom for a hero's myth. The townspeople, led by Bear and Ares, gathered at the base of the ridge, their silent presence a jury that Miller could no longer intimidate. Silas emerged from the tree line, Ares limping. At his side, the dog's black fur rimmed with the gold of the rising sun. Out of the obsidian shadows of an old hunting blind, a figure stepped forward, a man draped in a tattered, oil-stained military parka, his face a map of frostbite and sorrow, but his eyes unmistakably those of Liam Miller. Liam hadn't died. He had been the sole survivor of a botched CIA black op that his father had helped facilitate for profit, and the sheriff had forced him into a living death to protect the secret. The reunion was not marked by shouts, but by the primal, joyful howl of Ares, who lunged forward to bury his nose in Liam's hand. The sheriff's gun dropped into the snow with a dull thud, his authority evaporating like mist as Colonel Sterling stepped forward to place him in federal custody. Months later, the ice on North Creek had finally surrendered to the insistent warmth of a Minnesota spring. The ghost of Silas Vance had been replaced by a man whose name was spoken with a reverence that felt like a quiet prayer. Silas stood on the same cliff where the truth had been unearthed, the green buds of the birch trees whispering in a gentle wind. Beside him stood Ares, now fitted with a sleek carbon fiber prosthetic leg designed by Ares Thorne, his black coat shimmering in the midday sun. Ares sat perfectly still, his amber eyes tracking the flight of an eagle over the turquoise waters. He wasn't guarding Silas from ghosts anymore. He was guarding the peace they had built together. Silas looked down at the dog, the soul reader who had seen through the darkness of war and the lies of man to find the light. He placed a hand on Ares's head, feeling the steady, powerful thrum of a heart that had never faltered. They were no longer pariahs or soldiers. They were simply two survivors who had found their way home. As Ares let out a short, happy bark that echoed across the valley, Silas finally smiled, a real, unfiltered expression of a man who knew that while the light may sometimes dim, as long as there is a dog to lead the way, it never truly fades. Sometimes God does not send miracles as thunder from the sky. Sometimes he sends them quietly through a faithful dog lying beside a broken man, or through a stranger who chooses to stay when the world walks away. In our daily lives, we all face storms that threaten to bury our hope, and we all carry wounds that we think will never heal. Silas and Ares remind us that no soul is ever truly lost, as long as there is love to guide it home. As long as there is love to guide it home. This story is a testament to the fact that the heart remembers what the mind might forget, and that divine grace often speaks through the loyalty of those who love us without conditions. If this story touched your spirit or reminded you of a miracle in your own life, please share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment below to let us know which part of this journey moved you the most, and subscribe to our channel to stay connected for more stories of hope and healing. May God bless you, protect your family, and bring a quiet, lasting warmth to your heart tonight.